Alabama, 1847. They called her Goliath's daughter, not because she was evil, but because she stood 6 feet 8 inches tall and could snap a man's neck with her bare hands like breaking a twig. Born to enslaved parents on Ironwood Plantation, Minerva had spent 28 years being treated as both a freak of nature and a weapon of mass labor by her master, Captain Ezekiel Morrison. But on one sweltering August afternoon, something ancient and primal awakened inside the giant woman, and what happened next would echo through Alabama folklore forever. Listen to this and let it sink deep into your soul. You're standing in front of a woman who towers over you like a living monument, her hands the size of dinner plates, her arms thick as tree trunks. For nearly 3 decades, you've used her incredible strength to build your fortune, worked her harder than any mule, and displayed her to visitors like she's some kind of circus animal. You've beaten her, humiliated her, and reminded her daily that despite her godlike physical power, she's still your property. Now imagine that same giant woman finally deciding she's had enough. Picture those massive hands, calloused from decades of impossible labor, slowly curling into fists. Watch those tree trunk arms rising above her head as she towers over you like an avenging angel. Feel the ground shake as she takes that first step toward you, her eyes burning with 28 years of accumulated rage. This is the moment when Captain Morrison realized that owning a giant doesn't make you powerful. It just means you've been keeping a sleeping earthquake chained in your backyard. And when earthquakes finally move, everything around them gets crushed to dust. But this story isn't just about size or strength. This is about what happens when you push someone so far beyond their breaking point that they discover they're not just big, they're biblical. Minerva didn't just kill Captain Morrison. She obliterated him so completely that they had to identify his remains by his gold teeth. She turned murder into geology, crushing bone and flesh back into the earth with the kind of force that usually takes mountains to generate. So let me ask you something that will shake you to your core. If you had the physical power of a giant, but lived as someone's property, how long would you let them treat you like a beast of burden? How many years would you endure being displayed as a freak before you showed them what a real monster looks like? Because Minerva waited 28 years, and when Goliath's daughter finally struck, she didn't just kill her oppressor, she literally ground him into the Alabama clay with her bare hands, creating a crater where a human being used to exist. Let me paint you a picture of what made Minerva different from every other enslaved person in Alabama. Picture a woman so tall that she had to duck to enter most buildings, so broad that she could carry 2 full, grown men under her arms like sacks of grain. Her hands were massive enough to palm a man's head like a basketball, her legs thick as oak trees, her back so wide it cast shadows in the noon sun. Born in 1819 to field slaves Rebecca and Samuel, Minerva's size was apparent from birth. She was nearly twice the size of normal babies, requiring special care just to survive her first months. By age 5, she was as tall as most 10-year-olds. By 10, she was bigger than many adult men. By 15, she had reached her full height of 6 feet 8 inches and weighed close to 300 pounds of pure muscle. Captain Morrison saw dollar signs the moment he laid eyes on the teenage giant. He purchased her for triple the normal price, not just for her labor potential, but for her value as a curiosity. Here was a black woman who looked like she could have been carved from stone by some pagan god, a living contradiction to every assumption about feminine weakness and racial inferiority. But Morrison's genius, and ultimately his fatal mistake, was recognizing that Minerva wasn't just big, she was impossibly strong. While other plantation owners might have displayed her as a novelty, Morrison put her incredible strength to work in ways that generated enormous profits. She could do the work of 5 men without breaking a sweat. She could lift loaded wagons out of mud, carry massive logs that normally required teams of workers, and perform feats of strength that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The cotton gin at Ironwood Plantation was powered entirely by Minerva. While other plantations used teams of mules or complex mechanical systems, Morrison simply had his giant slave turn the massive wheel by hand. She could process more cotton in a day than most plantations managed in a week, single-handedly making Ironwood one of the most profitable operations in Alabama. But physical labor was just the beginning of Morrison's exploitation. He quickly discovered that wealthy plantation owners would pay premium prices to witness Minerva's incredible feats of strength. Every month, he would host demonstrations where neighboring planters would gather to watch the giant woman perform impossible tasks for their entertainment. She would lift fully loaded wagons above her head while the crowds cheered. She would break thick chains with her bare hands, while wealthy men placed bets on whether the metal would snap. She would uproot entire trees and carry them across the plantation yard while visitors gasped in amazement and discussed her body like she was a prize animal at auction. Morrison charged $5 per person to witness these demonstrations, more money than most people earned in a month, making him wealthy not just from Minerva's labor, but from exhibiting her strength like she was a circus attraction. For 15 years, from age 13 to 28, she endured twice monthly exhibitions where she was forced to display her power for the amusement of people who saw her as less than human. The psychological torture was even worse than the physical exploitation. Minerva was completely isolated from normal human interaction. Other slaves were afraid of her size and strength, not understanding that inside the giant body lived a gentle soul who had never wanted to hurt anyone. The white overseers treated her with a mixture of fear and contempt, using her strength when convenient, but never forgetting that she could kill them all without effort. Morrison himself seemed to take special pleasure in reminding Minerva that despite her godlike physical power, she was still his property. He would have her perform the most degrading tasks imaginable, making her crawl on hands and knees to show that giants could be humbled, forcing her to carry him on her back like a child while visitors laughed at the spectacle. But the worst humiliation came during the strength demonstrations, when Morrison would invite visitors to examine Minerva's body like she was livestock. Men would poke and prod her muscles, measure her arms and legs, discuss her breeding potential as if she couldn't hear them. Women would gasp at her size and make jokes about what kind of children such a giant might produce. Through all of this, Minerva maintained what Morrison called her docile nature. She never fought back, never showed anger, never gave any indication that the constant humiliation and exploitation was affecting her psyche. To Morrison and his visitors, she appeared to be exactly what they wanted, a gentle giant who had accepted her role as both labor and entertainment. They couldn't have been more wrong. Inside that massive frame, rage was accumulating like pressure in a volcano. Every humiliation, every degrading display, every moment of being treated like a trained animal was being stored away in a part of Minerva's mind that was growing darker and more dangerous with each passing year. She wasn't docile, she was calculating. She wasn't gentle, she was patient. And she wasn't accepting her fate. She was planning something that would shake the very foundations of Alabama. The transformation began on August 15, 1847, during what Morrison had advertised as his biggest strength demonstration yet. He had invited over 50 plantation owners and their families to witness Minerva perform her most impressive feats, charging premium prices for what he promised would be an unforgettable display of human power. The crowd gathered in the plantation's main yard, sipping mint juleps and fanning themselves in the Alabama heat, while Morrison prepared his giant for the show. Minerva stood in the center of the crowd like a dark monument, her massive frame casting shadows across the assembled white faces that had come to gawk at her strength. The demonstrations began normally enough. Minerva lifted a fully loaded cotton wagon above her head, holding it steady while the crowd counted to 30. She broke a 2-inch thick chain with her bare hands, the metal snapping like rope while wealthy men cheered and placed bets. She uprooted a mature oak tree and carried it 50 yards. The massive trunk balanced on her shoulders like it weighed nothing. But something was different this time. Instead of the usual blank expression she wore during these humiliating displays, there was something burning behind Minerva's eyes, a flicker of awareness, of consciousness, of long-suppressed rage finally beginning to surface. Morrison, drunk on applause and bourbon, decided to add a new element to the show. He ordered Minerva to kneel so that the crowd could better appreciate her size, making her crawl around the yard on hands and knees while he rode on her back like she was a beast of burden. "Look at this," Morrison shouted to the delighted crowd. "The strongest woman in Alabama, tamed like a gentle horse. She may be a giant, but she knows her place." The crowd roared with laughter as Morrison spurred Minerva forward, digging his heels into her ribs while she crawled through the Alabama dirt. Children pointed and giggled at the spectacle of the giant woman being ridden like an animal. Adults discussed her breeding potential and wondered aloud what kind of children such a creature might produce. That's when something snapped inside Minerva's mind like a cable under too much tension. She stopped crawling. Morrison, surprised by the sudden halt, kicked harder at her ribs and shouted for her to continue. But Minerva didn't move. She simply knelt there in the dirt, her massive frame trembling with something that the crowd initially mistook for fatigue, but was actually the physical manifestation of 28 years of rage finally reaching its breaking point. "Get up, you lazy beast," Morrison screamed, raising his riding crop to strike her. "Show these people what you can do." Minerva slowly turned her head to look at him, and for the first time in 15 years of demonstrations, the crowd saw something in her eyes that made them step backward. It wasn't submission or docility or the gentle acceptance they had grown used to seeing. It was murder. Morrison raised his crop again, but before he could bring it down, Minerva's massive hand shot up and caught his wrist. The sound of small bones breaking was audible even over the crowd's sudden gasps of shock. Then, with the slow deliberation of a mountain avalanche, Minerva began to stand. As she rose to her full 6'8" height, Morrison dangled from her grip like a child's doll, his feet kicking frantically as he tried to free himself from the giant's grasp. The crowd, which moments before had been laughing at the spectacle, was now backing away in terror as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of American slavery. A giant was done being entertained. Morrison screamed for help, but the overseers who might have intervened were frozen in terror at the sight of the giant woman slowly crushing their master's wrist in her massive fist. The crowd, which had come to see displays of controlled strength, was now witnessing raw, primal power being unleashed for the first time in Minerva's adult life. With her free hand, Minerva reached up and plucked Morrison from her back like removing a tick from a dog. She held him at arm's length, his 150-pound body suspended in the air by her grip on his now mangled wrist, while he kicked and screamed like a terrified child. "Please," Morrison whimpered, his voice cracking with fear as he stared into the giant's burning eyes. "I've always treated you well. I've given you good food, decent quarters. You're valuable to me." Minerva's response was to slowly close her other massive hand around Morrison's head. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as the giant woman's fingers completely encompassed her master's skull, her palm covering his face while her fingertips met at the back of his head. For a long moment, she simply held him there, suspended between her two hands like a rag doll, while Morrison's muffled screams leaked out between her fingers. Then she began to squeeze. The sound of Morrison's skull cracking was like a walnut being crushed in a vise, sharp and final and absolutely terrifying to everyone who heard it. His muffled screams cut off abruptly as Minerva's incredible strength compressed his head beyond the point where human consciousness could exist. But she wasn't finished. With Morrison's lifeless body still dangling from her grip, Minerva turned to face the crowd of white faces that had spent 15 years treating her like a trained animal. Her eyes, burning with decades of suppressed rage, swept across the terrified plantation owners who suddenly realized they were witnessing their worst nightmare come to life. A giant slave had remembered that she was strong enough to kill them all. The crowd scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Wealthy plantation owners and their families fleeing in terror as Minerva dropped Morrison's crushed corpse and began walking toward them with the slow, deliberate pace of an earthquake made flesh. Some tried to reach their carriages, others simply ran into the woods, but all of them carried with them the image of the giant woman standing over her master's destroyed body, like a dark goddess of vengeance. Minerva didn't pursue them. She had made her point, delivered her message, and proven that giants, when finally awakened, could reshape the world with their bare hands. Instead, she calmly walked to the plantation house, gathered the few possessions that meant anything to her, and disappeared into the Alabama wilderness like a force of nature returning to its source. The manhunt that followed was the largest in Alabama history, but how do you track a giant who has decided to become invisible? Minerva's size, which had made her a spectacle for 15 years, now became her advantage as she moved through swamps and forests where no normal person could survive. Her incredible strength allowed her to travel distances and overcome obstacles that would stop any ordinary fugitive. More importantly, she had become a legend among the enslaved population throughout the South. The story of the giant woman who had crushed her master's skull spread through slave quarters like wildfire. Whispered proof that even the most oppressed people could find ways to fight back when they finally decided they'd had enough. Several plantation owners reported sightings of a massive woman moving through their property at night, sometimes leaving behind evidence of impossible feats of strength. Uprooted trees, moved boulders, structures demolished with what appeared to be bare hands. Whether these were actually Minerva or copycat legends inspired by her story was never determined, but the psychological impact was the same. The giant was still out there, and she was still angry. Minerva herself was never captured, never seen again after that August afternoon in 1847. Some claimed she died in the wilderness, too large to hide and too dangerous to approach civilization. Others insisted she made it north, where her incredible strength would make her valuable to the Underground Railroad, and her size would make her a legend among freedom fighters. But the most persistent legend, the one that still echoes through Alabama folklore today, claims that Minerva is still out there in the deep woods and hidden swamps, living like the force of nature she always was. According to these stories, she protects runaways and punishes those who would harm the innocent, using her giant strength to serve justice in places where law and order fear to tread. Captain Morrison's death was officially recorded as an accident, the local authorities too embarrassed to admit that a slave had literally crushed her master's head with her bare hands. The ironwood plantation was abandoned within weeks, no one willing to work or live in a place where a giant had turned murder into geology. The cotton gin that Minerva had powered with her own strength was dismantled and sold for scrap. The demonstration yard where she had been exhibited for 15 years was left to grow wild. The entire plantation became a monument to the power of patient rage finally unleashed. Today, the site of Ironwood Plantation is marked only by overgrown foundations and twisted metal from the cotton gin that once showcased Minerva's incredible strength. Local folklore claims that on quiet nights, you can still hear the sound of massive footsteps moving through the Alabama woods, and sometimes find evidence of impossible feats of strength performed by unseen hands. But in the oral traditions of Alabama's African-American community, Minerva lives on as more than just a legend. She represents the ultimate expression of resistance, proof that no oppression is so complete that it cannot be overcome by sufficient strength and determination. The giant woman who was displayed as a freak for 15 years proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is the simple decision to stop accepting it. Her story serves as a testament to the fact that physical power means nothing if you don't have the will to use it. But when gentle giants finally decide they've had enough, they can literally crush their oppressors back into the earth. Minerva didn't just kill Captain Morrison, she obliterated the myth that size and strength could be permanently controlled through psychological manipulation. Most importantly, the legend of Goliath's daughter illustrates how systems of oppression often create the very forces that will eventually destroy them. By making Minerva perform her strength for entertainment, Morrison had inadvertently reminded her daily of exactly how powerful she really was. By isolating her from normal human relationships, he had created a creature who had nothing left to lose when she finally decided to fight back. The giant woman who crushed her master's skull with her bare hands proved that patience, even in the strongest people, has limits. And when those limits are finally reached, the results can be literally earth-shaking. Her legacy lives on in the knowledge that true power doesn't come from owning giants, it comes from being one, and finally deciding to act like it. In the end, Captain Morrison's greatest mistake wasn't buying a giant slave. It was forgetting that giants, when awakened, don't just rebel. They reshape the landscape around them with their bare hands, grinding oppression back into the dust from which it came.